Today, we're going to talk about Section 8 housing here in the Chicago market, and we're going to go over everything you need to know here in 2026. On January 1st, 2023, Governor Pritzker signed into law a ban against discriminating with source of income. And really what that translates to is if a Section 8 tenant applies for your rental, you cannot say, I will not work with them because you are now discriminating against their source of income, which is Section 8 or government money. With that law coming into effect over the last few years, that means so many more landlords have realized, one, it's a law, or as their vacancies have came up, they realize now they have to open up their understanding to Section 8. And each year there's changes. And what we're going to talk about here today is everything you should know here in 2026. First, depending where you're at in the Chicago market, Section 8 is administered by various programs. We all have heard of CHA or Chicago Housing Authority, and they control everything inside Chicago. HACC, Housing Authority of Cook County, handles all of suburban Cook County. DHA, DuPage Housing Authority, handles DuPage and Kendall. Then you have a bunch of other agencies that will cover specific to Aurora, specific to Elgin, Maywood. You have Lake County, you have McHenry. So depending where you're at, you'll follow and work with different Section 8 agencies. Now, anyone that's worked within multiple of these agencies understands it's all the same governing rules, but every entity runs a little different. You won't have many people that will disagree with you that things in dealing with CHA are a little more difficult than dealing with McHenry housing. Those are not necessarily one reason or another to work with one or the other, but that's just the reality. In recent years, all of the agencies have made changes to their programs or how they really operate on a day-to-day that actually are benefiting landlords. But they're a government agency and they do move slower than most of us entrepreneurs. So although things are getting better, they still do move slower than if you're working with a market tenant. And when I say slower is from the time you find a tenant to the actual day they move in will always be slower than if you found a market tenant and they're moving in a week later. Now, there's plenty of benefits to working with Section 8 programs. They stay longer. I know we ran for our portfolio, at any given time, we have about 10% subsidy residents amongst our 1,500 or so units. And we figured this out at the end of 2025, but they're staying probably about 30% longer than a traditional market tenant. Now, the main benefit people always talk about is guaranteed income from the government. Now, one myth I want to clarify is most of the time, you're not getting 100% of your rent paid by Section 8, but they're usually paying a large portion. And the difference in how much the tenant pays versus how much the housing provider pays is going to break down to how much income the tenant has. There's another myth that Section 8 tenants just don't work. I would say probably more work than don't. And some will work part-time, some will have larger income, some have full-fledged out careers. So depending on how much income they have will depend on what that split is of what you get from the housing provider on the first versus the tenant. Now, another myth that I want to make sure I throw out there because I get these questions all the time is how you screen a Section 8 tenant. Now, income is obviously less of an issue when you're screening your tenant, but you should still screen any subsidy-based tenant the same way you would screen your market tenant. A lot of people assume that the housing provider, CHA, DHA, they're doing the screening for you. But no, a tenant comes in, you should screen them. And I would say this, when it comes to market tenants, you have some bad actors and then you have amazing tenants. And there's a whole spectrum of people in between. And that's no different than your normal subsidy tenant. You have bad actors and you have amazing ones, and there's a whole spectrum in between. So you want to make sure you screen and follow your process. And if you don't have a screening process, you should have that for any applicant that comes in so you're consistent to make sure you're never getting in trouble for any fair housing laws. I mentioned earlier in this video that Section 8 has been making improvements that actually benefit the landlord in recent years. And one of those specifically is what HACC rolled out, Housing Authority of Cook County. What they do now is they will give you rent determination prior to going out and doing the inspection. So how it used to work is tenant comes to you, applies, you say, this is great, I'll work with you, you fill out the paperwork, you submit it to the housing program, and they will come out and they'll do an inspection of your unit. Maybe it usually takes, anything from 7 to 14 days. After they do the inspection and you pass it, they'll give you a rent determination. They'll say, hey, per this property, based on market rent and based on what we can pay for the zip code, we'll pay you this much money. And sometimes that frustrates people because they were unable to really get a hold on the specific number they were going to get paid for, because it isn't as black and white as with a market tenant in the sense of, I'm renting this place for $1,500, a market tenant will pay me $1,500, Section 8 will pay me $1,500. Most of the time it's different. It might be a little less, it might be a little more, but that's probably a really important number that a lot of people want to know. So what HACC changed recently was now you submit the paperwork and within a week, they call you with your rent determination prior to putting you through the whole inspection process, which is super motivating. You can understand everything you're gonna get. You could either get excited because now you're gonna get way more rent and that side of things, or if it's lower, you could at least speak with the housing administrator and talk to them about, why it is lower. And maybe you could show them some comps of comparable properties and maybe even negotiate with them to get them up to where you need to be. The other thing of the rent conversation is increases. There's always that myth out there that, once a tenant moves in, I can never raise rent, but that is very untrue. So there's a specific process to it, and you have to submit paperwork within so many months of the lease expiring, request a specific increase. And they'll either give it to you or they won't. But it's similar process to the rent determination up front, where if it fits the guidelines of how much is market rent in the area, they can usually meet what you're asking. And if they don't, you can at least go through the process of, I'll use the word challenging, but challenge them or contest what they're actually willing to go up to, or if they're not offering any sort of increase. If you like this topic here, we're dropping a video every week, so make sure you subscribe, and we'll see you soon.